Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Food Tech Show. This is your host, Michael Wolf, and today's guest is none other than Chris Young, the co-author of Modernist Cuisine, co-founder of ChefSteps, and the founder of a new company called Combustion. And this conversation is actually something a little bit different than what we normally do, and probably something we'll be doing more of in the future. We had a conversation on Clubhouse, that new audio app that I'm sure many of you heard of, and I asked Chris if I could record it because, hey, why not do some double duty, get a podcast out of it? And he said, sure. And so you'll hear a little bit of, me welcoming him on stage. It's almost as if we're at a live event, because that's really what it is. It's just kind of on an app, living in the internet while we're doing it. And we have a fun, long conversation. And the great thing about this conversation and kind of one of the fun things about Clubhouse that would be different than a normal podcast is I was able to welcome Joe Ray, the kitchen tech reviewer from Wired, on stage, and have a few other guests on stage as well. So it was a fun, interactive conversation. There was some real interesting insights that Chris had and others had, and just some topics that we discussed that were really interesting, including, what Chris was doing differently with his new startup based on some of the lessons he learned at ChefSteps, as well as, what Chris thinks about the future of restaurants, which was a really fun and interesting conversation. I wasn't really expecting to go there, but we talked about that. We talked about things like Mr. Beast in the launch of virtual restaurants and how he thinks that'll impact things. And I'll be honest with you, he had some thoughts that, this was a really big deal. So it's a really fun, interactive conversation. I hope you enjoy it. As always, if you want to get more food tech shows, just look for them in your favorite podcast app, wherever you get podcasts. And as always, you can go to thespoon.tech and check out that as well. So thanks everyone for listening. I hope you enjoy this conversation, and we'll talk to you soon. Hey, Chris.
Hey, Mike. How are you?
I'm doing well. You made it.
I did.
It's always a relief. It's always a relief when the main attraction, the person you're interviewing, actually makes it on stage.
Well, I've been seeing everyone talk about Clubhouse on my Twitter feed for a couple of months now, so this is my first time to get to try it. So I think I get the idea. Yeah,
it's a lot of fun, and it's funny it seems like maybe half the rooms, anywhere from like 25% to half the rooms on Clubhouse for a while were talking about Clubhouse. So let's get the ball rolling. I see some friendly faces in the front row. To start the room and reset the room, just to let everyone know, my name is Mike Wolf. I'm with The Spoon, and we're going to be having a conversation with Chris Young, Chef Chris Young, who is starting a new company. A lot of you may know Chris Young from his former company, ChefSteps. You may also know him from Modernist Cuisine. So excited to have you on stage today, Chris. Welcome.
Thanks for having me, Mike. And I'll just say I see at least one person in the front row who's known me since my Fat Duck days. Yeah, I'm looking at you, Jeff.
So let's start the conversation. So, Chris, you announced your new company yesterday. I was really intrigued because you were kind of hinting at it on LinkedIn, a little bit on Twitter. I think you actually put Combustion on your LinkedIn profile maybe a month or so ago. And I'm thinking, what is Chris up to? I thought you were going to take some time off. I thought you were going to maybe take a couple years before you started your new company.
That was kind of the plan. We sold ChefSteps to Breville in July of 2019. And, after a little bit of back and forth, I decided moving to Sydney and becoming sort of a corporate citizen wasn't a really good fit for me. And ChefSteps had been 8 years of work. And before that, Modernist Cuisine with Nathan and Grant and Max and the team and Ryan had been, that had been 5 years of work. And before that had been the Fat Duck with Heston for 5 years. So the original plan was, take a sabbatical, live abroad again, travel with the family. And, we were actively making plans of where we were going to travel in 2020. And, then everything kind of came off the rails in February. I guess I'm sort of a compulsive inventor and tinker. So, I was playing in my kitchen. I have a bunch of ideas in the outdoor cooking space that I had wanted to work on and, playing around with that and making a thermometer. It kind of fell out of me tinkering with my barbecues. I just wanted a product that would let me measure some things and do some things and control some things without a rat's nest of wires, and that nothing else really did off the shelf. And I know enough of the types of folks who can work with me to build such things that, we started making prototypes, and it wasn't too long before that really just sort of evolved into, hey, this would be a pretty great product. We should build a company around it. So I guess Combustion Inc., like just about everything else I've done, is a bit of, dumb luck, and, isn't operating with some sort of master plan. But, in the last couple of months, the closer we've been getting with prototypes getting built and with manufacturing starting to get put together. And then, of course, working on the branding and the product announce, I found a kind of energy that I haven't had, I think, really since the beginning of Chef Steps. So I couldn't be more excited about where I think this can go.
And for those who want to know a little bit about it, you can maybe multitask. The problem with Clubhouse, but maybe also one of the cool things is you don't have the ability to link out. So you can go to my profile, see my Twitter link, and the first tweet that I pinned is the link to Clubhouse, but also the story I wrote about Chris's new company. So if you want to read a little bit while you're listening in, feel free to do that. But what struck me, Chris, about the new product was the simplicity of it. So, when I looked at Joule, your flagship hardware product from a previous company, it was a fairly complicated thing, right? It was this idea of sous vide, which in and of itself is targeting. It's a fairly advanced cooking technique, maybe for some people. It was targeting what I would call maybe foodies, people who are really enthusiastic about it. And it was this thing where you actually needed an app to turn it on. I think that was a brave kind of design choice. Like, I think you'd admit that, like, not actually having any physical buttons on the appliance.
I still remember the day we announced, there was a comment in Reddit that said, whoever made this decision to take the controls off this sous vide device should be dragged into the street and shot. So that would be me. And we can talk maybe about some of the thinking behind that decision. I would say it, in certain ways, forced us to solve some problems, and there was a lot of benefit to it. But there's no question it handicapped us in the market.
Yeah, like it was like, I mean, I liked the Joule a lot. It was my go-to sous vide circulator for a while. And by the way, we're going to get to combustion. Don't worry. But I actually started using my Innova a lot just because, hey, I was just tired. I don't want to pick up my phone, and that sous vide circulator is really easy, plug in and press a button. So if you did it over again, if you did the Joule over again, would you have put a button on there?
Yeah. Yes, it was. And in fact, that was supposed to happen. Joe Ray was actually working with the Chef Steps team back in that time, and we had designs for two versions of Joule. And for various reasons, that one didn't come to fruition. And there was a real bet about where we could go with that, but it was a really binary choice for people. We from a product standpoint, I think we had the better physical product. I'm incredibly proud of the design and engineering work we did there. But for a lot of people, it was just an A/B choice of like, no controls. I'm going to go with the Innova. And I hesitate to put a number on it, but would that have been the difference between Chef Steps retaining independence versus having to be acquired? Maybe. So some lessons learned there, and I think I'm carrying those forward into combustion.
So let's talk about that. When I look at the first product, there's really two products. It's the thermometer and it's the timer. They are selling as a bundle, but as you told me, you can buy them independently. It's a fairly simple product. When I look, first of all, a timer, I'm like, oh, you can't get more simple than that. And then you have this thermometer, which there are already some thermometers out there. So you had to tell me about it. You had to convince me that it's interesting. And you started talking about 8 sensors and this idea of like gradient heat. You could probably do a lot better job telling people about this, but why is your meat thermometer special? Why did you decide to do one? Why did you think that this needed to be in the market?
So, a few reasons. Look, at the end of the day, I think, a lot of my personal career as a chef has really been thinking about the role time and temperature plays in the kitchen. So, if you go back to the days of when I was cooking and running the experimental kitchen at the Fat Duck, this was when sous vide was first getting adopted by restaurants. And, all of a sudden you'd given professional chefs the most accurate thermostat they'd ever had in the kitchen. And chefs being very creative, adventurous, we were all trying and figuring out the things we could do with it. And so temperature control was a big deal. And in fact, when I left the Fat Duck to write Modernist Cuisine with Nathan, our original vision for that book was, we'll write a 300, 400 page book, mostly about sous vide. But as we got into it, we realized, there was, if you're going to explain how sous vide works, and if you're going to explain how temperature or how heat really flows in the kitchen, well, then you should explain how an oven works, and you should explain how your grill works and how a wok is actually working, because there's a lot of misconception around, how heat actually flows in the kitchen. And a lot of our intuition around it is just wrong. So, I'd say half of Modernist Cuisine is really just about the physics of heat transfer. I mean, pretty much half of volume 1, all of volume 2, a good part of volume 3. And, a lot of it comes down to humans are really bad at judging the temperature of something or how fast heat is really flowing to. Even if you're a very skilled chef, you can gain a lot of intuition for it. But if you do something that you've never cooked before, it's very easy to be wrong. A lot of the way we sort of cook a product over and over and get consistency in the kitchen is we keep everything the same. And once we kind of figure out how it works, we can do it a second time, a third time, and a fourth time. But if you give me a new cut of meat, a different size, a different shape, or I'm cooking with a different appliance, all bets are off. And this is why, most professional chefs have a digital thermometer. And I still think that, aside from a knife and a great pan, having a basic instant read thermometer is just something that would improve everybody's cooking. So, why make another thermometer? And a big part of it for me was I wanted to have a thermometer that would let me measure some temperatures that the real cooking temperature, the real cooking temperature of a roast when it's in your oven, or a brisket inside your smoker, or even a piece of fish if you're deep frying it, is the temperature at the surface of the food. Because the food's pretty much just shit with some water mixed into it, and that water's evaporating and sweating and cooling the surface off. And the question is how much? And the answer is you don't know. So if I want to control my barbecue or my oven with sort of a sous vide level of precision, it would be incredibly helpful if I could know what the temperature of the surface of the food is and then turn the temperature up or down accordingly to sort of control the cooking time, the cooking temperature. And there's no thermometer that will tell you easily the temperature of the surface. So I resorted to hacks of thermocouples, needle-like thermocouples that I could slip just beneath the surface. And I've been doing that for years, and it works great. But I figured if I could make a thermometer that would put a bunch of sensors along the sensor tube, not only could I figure out exactly where the core is, even if you kind of misposition the thermometer, I could measure the surface temperature, and I could measure the temperature just outside the surface of the food. And I could also get a sort of a profile, the gradient of temperature, so I could see how evenly the food is cooking. And being kind of a technological guy with a background in theoretical mathematics, I sort of knew that if I could get all those measurements, it'd become relatively easy to start to estimate, like, how big is the food? How quickly is it cooking? And from there, you can let computers do what they're great at, which is figure out how long should this cook for and how long should it rest for, because you've allowed them to build up a model of what your food's actually doing. And so that's all kind of behind the scenes, but the real point is I just wanted a tool that I could stick in my chicken and throw it into my smoker and have an easy way for it to tell me, if you want to cook it to 145 degrees Fahrenheit, you need to take it out of the oven in 34 minutes and you need to let it rest for another 8.5 minutes, and then it will be perfect. Like, that's the kind of stuff that is possible. And I think those are actually useful things to do. And it turns out you don't need an app for that, as long as there's some kind of kitchen timer that can display that information. So that was kind of the whole thought process that led to this product. But then I didn't want to handicap it with an app. I wanted you to be able to pull it out of your drawer along with the kitchen timer and just stick the probe into a piece of food if you need to quickly measure the temperature. You should be able to use it as an instant read thermometer. So I guess in a sense, I'm designing a product that's a thermometer that I've always wanted to have as a cook.
And I imagine it sounds like so much of what you just said is, okay, it's hugely technical in the background, but facing the consumer, it was really about simplicity, not doing any sort of pairing with an app, ability to just pull it out of the drawer, put it in the meat, and you have the reading on the kitchen timer. And I think that part of that focus on simplicity, we kind of got at this a little bit before, was you just learned some lessons from Chef Steps and you didn't want to repeat some of the same mistakes. And that was like not having to put the user through all these complicated things like pairing or app syncing or stuff that maybe drove them mad at some point. Like,
yeah, that kind of technology is proven as Bluetooth is and Wi-Fi is. It's really brittle, and when it works, everyone's happy. But it's so easy to fall into a sad path. And the open bug issue tracker for Jewel was enormous, particularly for Android, where Bluetooth is just a bag of hurt. And so that will kill a product. I mean, those were like, we generally got 5-star reviews on Amazon for our product until somebody had a problem with connectivity, and then they give us 1 star. Like, that was our Achilles heel. With this, my idea was, I don't want you to ever have to download an app if you don't want it. These things should just work. And there's a bunch of technical stuff we're doing behind the scenes, but at the end of the day, I made the decision that being able to sort of snoop on the temperature of somebody's thermometer is just not a big deal. So the thermometer just shouts into the wilderness every 200 milliseconds what temperatures it's measuring. And any phone, any device that knows how to read those advertisements can just listen in and show you the temperature. And so the benefit to that consumer is, if you pull the timer out and you turn it on and the probe is anywhere close to it, it's going to see that temperature and show it, and it's going to feel like it's connected by a wire. It just works. And if you have never used it before, but you do download the app, we're not going to make you create an account. We're not going to have you do all these things. If you as soon as you hit the app, if the probe is in range, then it takes about less than half a second before the probe is showing data from the temperature. So it feels instant. And we're just trying to take all of that friction out of the consumer experience, because I want people to use this as a cooking tool, not a gadget.
Yeah, and I don't think we need to go too much deeper into the Bluetooth technology. I do think it's interesting as a former networking technology analyst, like the design concepts that you went through. So again, I'd refer people to the post I wrote at the top of my Twitter.
Sure.
You can get to the bio, and I talk a little bit about what Chris is building. Also go to combustion.inc. I did invite Joe on stage, because I do want to have Joe to ask maybe a little bit of questions. But real quick, just standing back though, and talking about kitchen tech in general, it feels like there are a lot of mistakes made, misconceptions. If we look back, and I'm not talking just about Chef Steps, I'm just generally talking about a lot of the kind of the path people thought we were going to go down like 5 or 6 years ago. And a lot of people were excited about connectivity and all this, software driven cooking. What did we get right and what did we get wrong? If you're kind of talking about the industry at large, I mean, do you have any kind of thoughts about like, and then I would imagine some of that's going into what you're doing with combustion, but what did we get wrong looking back 5 years ago?
I think what we got wrong in a lot of ways is we got over enamored with the connectivity and didn't spend enough time thinking about what problem we're actually solving for customers. Things that I think we really solved correctly, stuff like the visual doneness flows in the Jewel app that help people express their human preferences of how they want their food cooked just by clicking on a picture or a short video loop. Like, that was hugely valuable and enormously successful and a real benefit to something that you could only really realistically do through a phone. The idea of being able to update a product and make it better over time, the more people use it. Those are, I think, things we got right. Stuff like trying to turn our customers into a platform and jamming connectivity down their throat. I'm probably the poster child for having gotten that wrong, but I don't think, I think every company working in the space was pushing pretty hard there, and it led to a lot of missteps and a lot of customer friction that just wasn't helpful.
I do want to welcome Joe Ray on stage. Joe is the kitchen guy for Wired, the kitchen tech guy for Wired, one of my favorite kitchen reviewers. And I'd love to, Joe, I know you haven't had a chance to look maybe too deeply at what Chris is doing, but I know that like one of the things you and I have talked about is you get a little bit annoyed by over techification of kitchen gadgets. I'd be curious to think what your initial impression is of kind of what the meat thermometer.
I think it looks good. I remember talking a long time ago with Chris about whether or not something like actually anything in the smart kitchen should be able to, you should be able to use it without using an app. And right from the beginning, that sort of drove me crazy. So it's, it's nice to see that something like this is out there or is about to come out and you don't have to use an app with it.
Yeah, I think, Chris, you and I were talking, and we both immediately thought of Joe and said, we can't wait to get his review of this.
Yeah. So Joe is secretly my customer, right? Like if you'll use this, Joe, in your kitchen and you're like, okay, this has become like my default thermometer, and I've thrown out my $5 Renwayne kitchen timer and I'm using your kitchen timer now because it's coated in silicone and the buttons are sealed, so I get it covered in goo. It doesn't matter. Like if I can convince you of that, then I think I've made the right product.
Well, I feel like IoT in the kitchen, the smart kitchen, kind of forgets that the kitchen has been evolving for so long and so long before we were using computers in our kitchen. And there was so much stuff that came out that just doesn't make sense or really want to see now that these things that we're using in the kitchen that are connected are more like steps on the way, and more of a progression instead of an entirely new thing. So I think that's encouraging.
What do you mean by that, Joe? With like steps on the way, steps on the way of preparing your meal, or can you unpack that a bit?
Well, think about a kitchen knife. Like a knife has been, people have making swords since medieval times, and then we start using knives in kitchens, and then we start to develop like what the curve of the belly of a knife is, and by doing that, to make a better knife would be incredibly hard because we've been thinking about something like that for so long. How do you make a knife rock better? Well, I'm not sure you can, or maybe it's just, a degree or half a degree or something like that. Where with IoT and the smart kitchen, a lot of stuff just came in and said, like, we're reinventing things. And so many things didn't need reinventing. So it's nice to see something like a thermometer that just helps us understand what's going on in our food a little better. Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, I think you've summarized it far better than I have so far.
And just to reset the room, as they often do here on Clubhouse, I just want to let people know we're up here on stage talking with Chris Young, the co-author of Modernist Cuisine, the founder of Chef Steps, and now the founder of his new company, Combustion Inc. I've also invited Joe Ray up on stage. Joe Ray is a well-known kitchen and culinary author and the main kitchen tech reviewer for Wired Magazine. And so, Chris, one of the things I wanted to ask you about, because I just thought this was such an intriguing quote. A lot of people look at Harold McGee as kind of like maybe one of the OG original guys in molecular gastronomy. And I interviewed him last year when he had just finished his tome, this massive book on smells. I don't know if you had a chance to pick it up. It's a great book.
I have a copy from Harold, and I have to apologize. I haven't read it yet.
Well, I had to read some of it because I interviewed Harold, and he did the same amount of loving and kind of deep research and writing about the world of smells as he did when he wrote that original book on molecular gastronomy. And what struck me, the key pull quote from that interview for me when I talked to Harold was, this is the guy who really got so many people into molecular gastronomy. But he told me, he goes, he kind of felt like that world had kind of plateaued. Like he was almost like bored with it. And that's kind of why he went down this path of writing the book about smells. And so I asked him, what do you think is interesting in food now? And he really talked about things like, okay, I think the future food stuff, what they're doing in plant-based, what they're doing in things like cellular agriculture and cultured meat. Like he's really intrigued by that. So I'd be curious how you react to that, if you're thinking along the same lines, and then kind of the second part of that question, if you do think molecular gastronomy is still interesting, where do you think it's interesting?
So molecular gastronomy is such a loaded word. I know that, I know Harold as a personal friend, and And honestly, I would never have become a chef if it wasn't for Harold. I was reading his book when I was in grad school for biomolecular structure design and decided to bail on that and become a cook. And so, in the early 2000s at the Fat Duck, at El Bulli, at WD-50, at Alinea, at a handful of other restaurants around the world, they all got labeled molecular gastronomy. Every single one of those chefs hated the term, but we didn't have really a better name for it at the time, so it kind of stuck. And what's interesting to me is all of the ideas that were sort of fomenting there and getting really distributed to kitchens all over the world as chefs moved around and learned from one another. A lot of those ideas did stick, and they've just kind of faded into the background of, this is just how you do stuff in a kitchen now. And so I suppose the movement is over. A lot of the ideas and lessons that are worth keeping have sort of stuck, and a lot of stuff that frankly was silly or tasted terrible has gone by the wayside. And you've had the new Nordic movement. You've had you've got a lot of stuff going on in Peru and Colombia and Brazil that's just super exciting. And it's a new movement. And I think that's just how culinary has always worked. If you have these movements, they seem to last around a decade or so. And the best ideas are sort of kept and assimilated, and everything else, gets forgotten for at least a few generations. And that's probably fine. And so for me, I think, there's a way of looking at modernist cuisine and saying it was sort of a capstone for that whole movement of we took all these ideas and put them in one book. And that was kind of Nathan's contribution and my contribution to the culinary world, trying to sort of put this reference tome together. And I suppose I lost some interest in it. I still find it interesting of how technology or an understanding of science can help make people a better cook. And that's kind of been my mission. But I think I'm not actively doing this. I know some people doing this. I'm intrigued by it, but it's like Harold, what's going on with plant-based cooking and what's going on with synthetic biology and synthetic food, like that is going to be the future. And it's really hard to see right now because it's such early days. Most of it is crap. But if you kind of squint and turn your head in just the right way and try to imagine where can it go, it's easy to imagine that in 10 years' time, you're going to have these 20-year-old chefs who don't have a lot of preconceptions that are getting these ingredients that have never existed before because we quite literally invented and created them. And they're going to do things that are going to melt my brain. And I can't wait for it. I suppose in some ways I'm a bit jealous that I'm going to be, a little too OG to be the kind of person that probably comes up with some of the most exciting ideas for those future innovations. And so at best, I look forward to being a fan and a spectator.
Hey, can I ask a question here?
Sure, go ahead, Joe.
Sure. So I like that idea of the sort of the fine dining and the fancy food versus, or I'm interested in the idea of fine dining and that kind of associated fancy food versus, or thought of against just becoming a cook cook at home. Chris, like in 10 years, what's going to dribble down, or what do you think is going to dribble down that people are going to be able to do at home that right now we only really see in a fancier kitchen?
I think some of the safe bet, like if I'm wagering money on this, the always safe bet, the bet red, bet black on the roulette table is that a lot of the inaccessible, rare ingredients, some of the most interesting ones are going to find their way into the mainstream audience. Like that's always happened. Things that used to be reserved for kings and royalty eventually become peasant food. And like, so that's going to happen. And what may be slightly different this time is, some ingredients might go the other way, where they start out as consumer foods because these companies that are inventing them, that are investing in the huge amounts of money it's going to take to create some of them, those companies have to aim at the mass market right away. And so what may very well happen is you kind of reverse that, where some of these super novel ingredients become food products that, you buy from Amazon and lots of people consume, and then they sort of trickle up to chefs who have new ideas of what you might do with them. There was a little bit of that going on with modernist cuisine. A chef like Wiley Dufresne was great at taking like industrial ingredients and thinking of incredibly clever things to do with them. I think that's something you might see more of, just because some of these novel ingredients are going to have to be mass market from day one.
Chris, I do want to ask you, there were some things you did that I thought were fairly brave from a technology standpoint at Chef Steps that I think I'm curious what you think of now, and you wonder if you should have done. I'm not talking about the no interface on your appliance, but like things like conversational cooking, where you actually wanted to take the ability to use chatbots, for example, or messaging and actually control cook that way. I mean, I've always been intrigued by the idea of new interfaces to do things that we already do. And so obviously we've seen the huge embrace of voice assistants, and everyone was thinking for a while that voice assistants were going to be the future of cooking in the kitchen. I don't know if we've gotten there or if we will get there, but I did like the idea of conversational cooking to cook with. Do you still feel like that type of idea has merit?
Yeah. I mean, if you think about it, what are sort of natural interfaces we already use in the kitchen? Like your voice is an incredibly useful tool. Like, when you're a professional chef, a lot of how you make things happen in your kitchen is by communicating your intent to your sous chefs, your chef de parties, and so on and so forth. And so to me, it always made sense that when your hands are covered in goop, a voice interface is great. I think there's been a lot of problems making that happen. And a big part of it is Amazon and Google can do all the work they want on making those technologies better at understanding your intent. But if the appliances that they're connected to are too stupid to know how to respond to that information, then it's not going to go anywhere. And I think right now, most of the major companies making appliances don't know how to think about a future where their devices are smarter and leverage software to allow humans to be more creative. Like that still hasn't happened. And I think part of it is, unlike a pure software company, if you're selling physical hardware for the kitchen, you have to deal with atoms. And, the number of people who seem to be able to think both about how do you design hardware, how do you deal with the realities of bending metal, but also what are the possibilities enabled by software and new human interfaces that allow the humans to be at the center of the kitchen, not sort of pushed to the edge. There's not many companies that I can know of, maybe none, that I think are thinking cohesively about that.
Thanks for that. I want to welcome Nick on stage. Nick Place. Hey, Nick, how are you? You have a question for Chris?
Good. Yeah. Chris, really interested in your product. It sounds really cool.
Thanks.
Fellow foodie myself. I love cooking. And I got really interested a little earlier in the conversation. We were talking about, synthetic foods, these plant-based. I don't know if you've seen these new milks that they are fermenting like grass into milk. And so, I was doing some research on farmers, and the U.S. only 1% of our farmers, of our population, farm. Do you think in the future, I don't know if this is, in your field, but, I could see maybe, the younger farmers being more like scientists rather than, typical rural farmers? Or do you think, no, we're going to need these, sunlight grown foods forever?
This is an area I've thought a little bit about, and I think there's a few challenges. First off, farmers aren't going to go away, but it will always be a smaller and smaller fraction of a sufficiently evolved society. And part of that is just our needs as a large society. We need food to be relatively inexpensive and affordable, and that drives everything about farming to be large scale. And so that will tend to push out a lot of the population from farming simply because they're not able to farm at scale. And if you think about what is required to, whether you're fermenting or brewing or 3D printing synthetic ingredients, that's also something that, just to be realistic, to actually make an impact on society and climate change and a bunch of things that could be good that come out of that, that also will have to operate at a scale and require a kind of capital that is going to preclude a lot of small farmers from sort of participating in it. And so I think you're going to continue to see that as a trend. If I'm a farmer, sure, I can use some of those ideas on the edge and the margin, but I need to specialize in growing high value crops, things that are more niche, but that people are willing to pay for. I think it's going to be really hard to be a smallhold beef farmer in a world of synthetic beef, unless you make the absolute best beef in the world, in which case you'll charge a fortune for it and it'll be a luxury ingredient. I think it'll be
right, or you're living in Africa.
Right. So I think that's going to be one of the challenges. And I think it's really easy to put rose-colored glasses on and imagine that having, going back to smallhold farms and everybody growing their own food, like that's something that you can really only afford to indulge in that fantasy if you're relatively well off.
Right. The equity gap is huge.
Yeah. I have no idea if I answered your question. So
no, it's interesting. No, yeah. Thanks a lot.
Thanks for that, Nick. So Chris, Nick brings up an interesting point, the future of the farmer. I'm curious about your thoughts on if you were giving it career advice to a young chef and, to follow a path. I think, we asked a similar question to Tyler Forrence last week, and he had one that kind of hewed to the more traditional path, like get a job, go to culinary school, get a job as a sous chef in a high-end restaurant. I'm just curious what your thoughts are around the future of the chef. And if you wanted to break into the space, what advice you'd give to someone?
Look, I think if you think you might want to be a professional chef, the best thing you should do is go intern at a restaurant for maybe 6 weeks. And if you still think that's a good idea after 6 weeks of getting your ass kicked, then A, you probably have a mental illness, and B, by all means, be a professional chef. It's kind of a litmus test. And I'm not a huge proponent of culinary school. I think a lot of them border on being fraudulent. We're not the professional restaurant industry is not generally an industry that pays a premium for a culinary education. You could even argue that there's a negative premium, that we pay you less because we have to detrain all the bad habits you picked up in culinary school. So I've never been a big advocate for that. I think professional cooking is always going to have a place. We all want to eat at restaurants. What I would be thinking about now is, what is the restaurant even going to be post-COVID? The idea that a restaurant can only be a dine-in facility where you've invested all this money into the dining room, and it's like that. I think we're going to see a complete fragmentation of the way people want to consume food prepared by other people. And there's, it's going to be a phenomenal time if you can cook to come up with ways of serving your customers, but you're not going to need a restaurant necessarily. So I would kind of argue look, learn to cook, but maybe you should build a YouTube channel rather than trying to invest in a restaurant, because you'll be able to reach your customers just through your YouTube channel and an app, and somebody else might prepare the food. So this is kind of a meandering answer, but my advice is you really want to be thinking about what the restaurant is going to be in the future, and a little less about, do I go get a culinary education and start cooking in a restaurant? I think that world is largely over.
All right. So you brought up and you teed it up, the future of restaurants, and, to your point, start a YouTube channel. Maybe are you talking about something like the Mr. Beast route? I don't know if you've been following the exposure.
Yeah. I think I saw that, and when everything just changed about restaurants. In the manufacturing world of consumer electronics, where I've spent the last 8 years, the people that design the products are very rarely the people that also manufacture it. That's something we figured out, in a lot of things. Apple designs it, Apple engineers it. Apple does not assemble them. They have somebody else who specializes in assembly do that. And restaurants are kind of weird because you've coupled the creative with the manufacturing. You might not think of a restaurant as a factory, but it's a small, micro-scale, horribly inefficient factory. And what Mr. Beast kind of showed is, we're going to be able to take apart the creative and the marketing and everything about the concept of the restaurant. We're going to be able to completely divorce that from the manufacturing, so that if you have a great idea and if you have an audience that gives a shit, then you're going to be able to do a deal with people who specialize in the manufacturing of recipes, and you'll be able to roll out a national chain of your bagel joints within a couple of weeks. And everybody who wants one of your bagels can get one of your bagels. And, going even weirder, maybe your recipes become NFTs that people can own and trade. And it's going to get super weird. And it probably sounds insane right now, but I looked at what Mr. Beast did and said, if I'm a chef at 20 years old today, I build a YouTube channel around my cooking and my ideas and my recipes, because within a couple of years, it's going to be easy for me to find people who will make this food on my behalf the way I want it done and get it into customers' hands.
Yeah, like restaurants are this super old school, like completely vertically integrated industry. And
with no scale.
With no scale. And like once you start to digitize, we saw with music, right? Once you start to digitize the music world, like you have worldwide reach, you have worldwide distribution. You don't have to do everything. And so the virtualization of the restaurant industry is interesting. Now, I do think it's going to be problematic. I mean, Mr. Beast to me is more of a licensing relationship than like he's not actually, he may not know anything about like actually running a restaurant or good food.
Does he need to?
Does he need to? I don't know. Yeah, you may be right. I mean, there will be some issues, right? If like the food actually sucks. So if you're Mr. Beast, if you're a future Mr. Beast, choose your partners wisely. And there's a lot of these ghost kitchen companies that are ramping up, and there's a lot of excess kitchen capacity in the world. So you could probably do that. But I do think that this probably is the future, but like we're going to have a lot of hits and misses.
Yeah, it's going to get super messy, and you're going to, and so, it's not to say that there aren't going to be good partnerships and bad partnerships. Like, look, I can find companies that would be good at manufacturing their product, and I can find companies that will completely blow me up and take out my company because they're so bad at doing their job. Like that's not unusual. Even if you own the restaurant, a lot of your job becomes how effectively you manage the team that's responsible for manufacturing recipes. Like you spend all this time thinking that coming up with the recipes, developing the ideas for the dishes is the really valuable thing. But you're only, it's something Heston used to say to me, you're only as good as your last service. You're only as good as the worst meal you served that night. And so it turns out about like 80% of the job of being a great chef is making sure that, the 5, 10, 20 people in your kitchen can do it consistently night in and night out. And that's like insanely hard. And there's some people who are great at it, and there's a lot of people who aren't. And I think when you separate it into the world of people who are great at coming up with the ideas, people who are great at selling other people that they totally want to eat this food, and you're going to find the people who can specialize in being really good at manufacturing, like sure, it will be messy and there will be misses, but ultimately I think the consumer wins because we'll be exposed to more ideas, more diversity, and have more ways to enjoy food together.
Okay, I don't want to go down too far down the nerdy kind of crazy science fiction path, but you did mention NFTs, right? And
sure.
One of the things I've enjoyed about Clubhouse is just I'm just intellectually curious about crypto, and it seems like the hot buzzwordy stuff in crypto right now is NFTs. So, can you make a connection for people between and we don't have, maybe this is getting too nerdy and in the weeds, but like you mentioned NFTs and food. Do you see a connection there?
Yeah, there's an interesting idea. So, something that has driven many a chef crazy is you can't copyright or protect or patent a recipe. It's one of these weird things of like, I can copyright and protect a photo I take. I can copyright and protect prose that I write. But if it's a recipe, anybody can take that. And that certainly made people insane over the years. Like I remember Kenji Lopez used to get really, really frustrated when Tasty would like completely rip off one of his ideas and repackage it and profit from it, right? And there was no way he could stop that. And you can sit here and debate whether somebody should or shouldn't be able to stop it, but it is that way today.
That's pretty interesting. I'm actually in the DeFi space, and I've created a couple NFT projects myself. And yeah, I mean, I've read that a lot, that recipes aren't copyrightable. And you could sell a piece of NFT like it's a piece of art from a chef. This
right.
is
exactly right. So you can imagine a chef comes up with a recipe that everybody loves, and somebody can buy that recipe and they can sell that recipe to somebody else. But if it's part of the blockchain, the chef who originally created the recipe could profit every time that transaction happens. You create one of the things that's super interesting about NFT is ideas become ownable in a way that they're not today in the culinary space. Again, there's totally room for debate of whether that's a good thing or a bad thing and what that might do to innovation. But I certainly think there's a lot of chefs who would love to be able to protect their creations, their recipes, or at least benefit from it every time somebody, copies it and cooks it.
And I mean, with supply chain traceability coming through now, and all the digital transactions, getting a royalty on every recipe, I don't see that being too far in the future.
Right. So imagine somebody whose job is just creating recipes. And if it's sort of like you've got these people who write songs, and some of them can be incredibly successful if like they become the de facto songwriter for Taylor Swift. So imagine you've got somebody who creates recipes that many of the best chefs in the world or the best ghost kitchens in the world buy from. All of a sudden, you can be a creative chef at home just coming up with ideas and never meeting a customer. You outsource all of that, but your ideas are protected and sold to the ghost kitchens, and you profit because you're able to consistently come up with incredible crowd-pleasing recipes.
So NFT is potentially the secret recipe, or the kind of maybe the linchpin for syndication and monetization of recipes, which haven't largely been able to monetize before. We've seen the music industry go to global distribution, but there was an easy way to do that. And they used things like DRM to kind of protect, right? And you had a lot of lawsuits against things like Napster. But recipes were always just kind of open, a lot more open source. But what you're seeing maybe is NFT could be the linchpin for potential monetization there.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I think you've it's weird, but there are other industries where the idea of creating the intellectual concept is hugely well compensated. And in all of those industries, music's a really good example. People specialize. People specialize at creating the idea versus executing the idea versus performing the idea. And I don't see, it's weird to think that isn't relevant in an art like cooking. It just hasn't happened because the technology hasn't enabled it. And I think you've got this weird confluence of like crypto and COVID and all of this stuff that's just and people getting more distributed. I think it's hard to imagine that it doesn't radically change in 10 years how dishes are created and what the concept of a restaurant is and what the concept of a chef is. So if you're going to culinary school now to be a cook, realize you're basically preparing yourself for a career the way things were, in the 20th century. You're not really creating, you're setting yourselves up for the way cooking will be done as a profession in the 21st century.
All right. I want to reset the room real quickly. We have Chris Young on stage, the founder of Chef Steps, founder of his new company, Combustion Inc., co-author of Modernist Cuisine. We have Joe Ray from Wired, Nick, who is new to the stage. He was on air and crypto expert, DeFi expert, but also Alex Smith. Hey, Alex, my friend from the UK. How you doing, Alex?
Hey, Mike. Doing well, thanks.
You have a question for Chris?
Yeah, I do. Chris, how you doing?
I'm doing well. How are you, Alex?
Yeah, very well. I enjoyed your, you mentioned YouTube, and I enjoyed your video, I think it was last week, about the surface temperature cooking. I'm just curious if you plan to continue down that YouTube route and keep pumping out some content based around combustion.
Yes, and not just around combustion. I think Chef Steps had a formidable team that was all about content creation. Like, we started as a media company before we made cooking tools, and I think in a sense that was maybe even a bit wrong-headed. Like, we were kind of trying to map on the way you created content. If you were making a book or making a TV show, we tried to map that onto how you act as a content creator in the world of YouTube and TikTok. And I look at it now and go, it's a world that rewards individual creators. It's a world that rewards nimbleness and speed of getting content out, and not enormous production teams that can produce really highly polished content, but slowly. And so you see me making a bet that says the best thing in the world you can do is build your own audience, learn what they want from you, and deliver that, whether it is creating content that educates them, inspires them, entertains them, or creating physical hardware that helps them cook. I'm just simply saying, the way I see the future is it's a world of individual creators that can find an audience that give a shit.
Yeah, very interesting. I like your answer. That was my only real question. I was just really curious about that. So appreciate you guys letting me jump in on that one.
More videos to work. I have to get back to doing some filming, hopefully this weekend. So nice. There's some ideas that are coming to fruition.
Great. I look forward to seeing them.
Thanks, Alex. Hey, Brad, how are you?
Yeah, good. Thanks, Michael. Chris, nice to meet you. I'm here in Seattle with you, and I was with a grocer in the area for 15 years, one that you probably know about and shopped at. So it's a pleasure to talk with you.
Cool. Are you able to tell us which grocer?
Metropolitan Market. We used to be known as Queen Anne Thriftway on the top of Queen Anne Hill.
Yeah, I used to live in Queen Anne, so that was my grocery store.
Oh, there you go. We were the store that if people were at Pike Place Market and they couldn't find something, sometimes we would get customers coming up saying, "Hey, the people sent us up here. Do you have this ingredient?" And so it was always fun taking care of them.
Yeah. No, cool.
Hey, so my thinking a little bit about your product development, which I'm excited about. I'm excited for your launch. And as you know, shopping as a customer at a grocery store, if you care about quality food, and there's a number of good grocers around the country that in each market that focus on good food. So let's say it's air-chilled poultry or high quality beef, prime rib, so forth, seafood. One of the things that often happens is they're shopping, they're spending a good amount of money on good products. They want it to end up tasting perfect. They want it to go right. And maybe they have people over for dinner. And so what you've got as a shopper, often they'll go into the store and depending on who you talk to, sometimes a meat manager might say, well, cook it at this. Or there might be recipe cards in the store that say this. But what seems to be missing in this process is a gap that when the customer gets home and they actually start to plan things out and time things out, and they've got their oven and they've got people, they've got other ingredients, there's always some surprises. And so this strikes me as a really interesting concept to not only help cooks at home who care about good food, just regular grocery shoppers, but also in their shopping process. Can you talk a little bit about you and the team as you went through thinking through the product, about how this might look and feel and work with somebody who's not a chef?
I'd love to say that there was this really disciplined process that we sat down and we mapped out the customer journey and yeah, that's not how I create products. It's more like, this would be cool. And a lot of it is, I am a home cook. I don't cook professionally in restaurants. I auction off a couple of charity dinners a few times a year, and my feet are so sore at the end of the night that I remember why professional cooking is a young person's game. So in a certain sense, I'm creating a product and I'm thinking about it from the perspective of somebody who's got a busy day job and kids at home and just trying to get food on the table can be a real chore. And I think that does help me make better decisions about how this product fits into a real person's life. But, I suppose I'm creating for myself. I think more broadly, it's stepping back and being able to really look and say, like, how could this be better? And so let's take your, like, how could technology actually make that better? Because I do think there's a role for technology in the kitchen. And, it's getting to the point where this is more doable. So you could imagine an experience where I'm going down the grocery store aisle and I pull my phone out because I usually have my phone on me in the grocery store, and I take a photo of the butcher's case. And I can, click on any of the cuts of meat or seafood that are in that photo, and the app basically can recognize them and say, that's a chuck steak. Here's things you could do with it. Giving people some inspiration and helping people figure out what to do is always a nice thing to do. And nobody has really built that capability, but to be sure it's going to get done. If I think about my world, what would be really nice is taking away that uncertainty of how long is this going to take to cook? How should I cook it? And, especially if it's something you haven't prepared before, recipes are very, very loose guidelines. It might actually be nice to be able to pull out your iPhone 12 and take a photo of that actual cut of meat unwrapped on your counter and have the photo be able to recognize the size and shape, because our phones have LiDAR now, and be able to say, hey, this is going to take approximately, this long to cook it. Look at this picture on your phone and choose the doneness you want. These are all things helping people have confidence that the food is going to come out the way they want and that they can plan the rest of their evening around doing that. It can get cumbersome, and a lot of times you need this technology to get out of the way. But when you'd like a little bit of hand holding, this is the kind of stuff that I think can ensure that if somebody spends $50 on, a big roast, that they're not going to screw it up. And in a certain sense, our thermometer is kind of the last mile of that whole experience of, if you did spend 50 miles on a roast, Wouldn't it be nice to be sure it's going to be perfect? Thermometers are better at that than humans are. Just stick a thermometer in it, put the timer on your counter, and about 20% of the way into the cooking, the timer kind of does what rice cookers have done for years. It pops up a countdown timer that tells you when to take it out in the oven, and as soon as you do, it switches over to how long you should rest it for. We're just trying to sort of step in a little bit with the technology to help the customer through their journey to getting the perfect meal.
Okay, I'd like to jump in here for a moment, please. So, Chris, why is it better, and I'm not saying you're saying it's better, but why would it be better to zap your steak with a LiDAR phone instead of just finding a good recipe, whether that's online or your favorite cookbook?
Because those recipes are wrong. And you've tested enough to know that there's all sorts of vagaries. It depends on your oven. It depends on the actual size and shape of your food. If a recipe says cook a chicken for an hour is not usually the exact right temperature to get the doneness you want. An hour is a gross approximation, and a skilled chef would know that, in about 50 minutes, I better start sticking a thermometer and kind of keeping an eye. And I guarantee you, more often than not, I've cooked something that says cook for an hour. I check it 45 minutes and it's cooking too fast and I need to pull it out and rest it right now. Because recipes are rounding things off. They're making the assumption that your oven is the same as their oven, that your cut of meat was butchered the same way as their cut of meat, that you're cooking the same amount of food at the oven at the same time. All of these things that matter. And humans, even a person who isn't a professional chef, can tell you pretty explicitly that chicken's dry or that chicken's just how I like it or it's too pink. And the difference between too pink and underdone and too dry and overdone is literally a couple minutes too long in a 400-degree oven.
So what if that was a good recipe and your thermometer, say?
Your problem with a thermometer is...
Your thermometer.
Oh, with my thermometer?
Yeah.
Then it works great. And so I'm not saying that. Well, actually, not exactly. The recipe gives you guidance. The recipe says, hey, it's going to take about an hour. That's helpful. If I know it's going to take about an hour, I can start to plan. And the timer, a thermometer and a timer that can give me a countdown to, hey, you need to pull this out in 12 minutes. Good, right? That kind of that's kind of the job. And you're right. That's the product we're building. But sometimes I don't have a recipe. Sometimes, and I tend to not cook with a recipe. So sometimes I might have a whole brisket. And being able to take a photo of the brisket and have it say, this is how long a brisket needs to cook for, it's just providing a recipe style of information in a different format. So I guess I'm just arguing that if you have a book, if you have a printed recipe, if you tore something out of a magazine, great, use that. If you have nothing, our phones do provide us ways to interrogate our world and learn something about it and maybe provide information just in time.
Buy that, Joe? Somehow I don't ever see Joe taking a picture of using a LiDAR on his meat.
Pew, pew, pew.
Hey, well, I just really want to I want to respect everyone's time. We're almost at an hour. And Chris, I know you're a busy guy with your new startup. I want to ask the next person on stage.
I think that's developer number 2 from Chef Steps.
Oh, hey, welcome on stage.
Hey, how's it going? First of all, I just wanted to congratulate you on your, launch and, being there, developing Joule with you and launching that. I know how exciting that must be like during this time. So congratulations on that.
Thank you.
My not really a question, but commentary on NFTs. And I've been thinking about this recently is, recipes around like cultural recipes or things that are like, like a traditional Chinese recipe or traditional Vietnamese. I'm Vietnamese myself, so this is something I care about deeply. Like, who gets to decide where the value of those kind of recipes that are kind of like community or like, 100 years of development, who gets to decide the value distribution on those things? I sometimes fear that it'll be like first mover advantage. I'm the first one with a Vietnamese recipe for banh mi, for example, and suddenly I get all this value and it's not really, deserving of me. It's maybe belongs to something greater than just an individual.
I mean, in any gold rush, it's never fair, right? And we see this with social platforms, like really smart startups, really smart entrepreneurs. Whenever there's a new platform like Clubhouse, we all race to use it because it's very easy to get growth and be successful in the early days. If you join Twitter now, if you join YouTube now, it's a slog to build your community because there's so much competition. So I think you're right. It's going to be a first mover advantage, and it won't always be fair. But, you know, is it unfair? I don't know that it's necessarily unfair. I was going to say, I don't know that it's unfair either, because you're just arguing a different definition of fair, that my more authentic recipe, my more traditional recipe should be more fairly compensated just because. And the answer is, well, ultimately, in theory, it will if it's truly a better recipe that more people enjoy. It just may be that your perception of its value and the sort of ambiguous algorithmic definition of what's its value will not be the same. And that's just the world we live in my opinion.
Yeah, and I think what we might be talking about is not really like, societally enforced patent structure around recipes, more of like a marketplace that's open, decentralized, where you can, profit off of your creations, not necessarily, try to, corner off a whole section of, because cultural value in recipes is important. And I think that's the reason why they're not copyrightable or patentable, is because, it's hard to, it is a process, but everyone does it different.
The weirder thing that's going to be a big debate is, just like in a bunch of other industries where all of a sudden the ability to own distribution rights becomes a valuable thing, publishers have kind of been this way for years in cookbooks, and they can be quite evil about it, if I'm honest. You're going to, if you actually were to start seeing recipes be valuable and the creators of the recipes get remunerated, what will happen is you will have a small number of big corporations that buy up all those rights and control all of that. And we'll have a discussion of whether that's fair or not. Like, it's legally okay. But the idea that, once that happens, the idea that you can be successful as a small creator is going to get very hard.
Well, this has been fascinating. I could talk about NFTs and cooking all day. And I have really enjoyed talking with you, Chris, about what you're building. And I think other folks have enjoyed it as well. I'm glad that we've had a chance for Joe Ray to come up on stage. We're always interested to get your opinion, Joe. Thank you for that. But I just want to thank you for doing this, guys. This has been a lot of fun.
Thank you very much. And Joe, I look forward to convincing you that LiDAR is the future of the kitchen.
Fat chance.
All right, everyone. Thanks a lot.
To you guys.
Thanks a lot, guys. We'll talk soon. Bye, everyone.
Bye.